What I would say to young Cambodians, lift your head up, look outside, look left and right, understand how things work.
Where should we invest our limited resources and
recognize your right. Future of a country lies in the hands of the people of that country and their government.
We need to be the one that discuss about the direction of the country.
Why do women choose to have less babies?
Where are we moving into in the next 20 years? Welcoming you, Joseph Scheuer, Mr. Joseph Scheuer, easily known as Joe.
Yep.
Let me introduce myself first. I'm pretty sure you know who I am, but you're our first guest, our first Future Forum podcast guest, particularly in English, where we're going to be discussing global megatrends and its implications on Cambodia and what should Cambodia understand, what should we know. So this podcast is to try to contextualize the world and its relevance to us, a small state within South Asia. Future Forum, as you know, is a think tank, a public policy research institutions focusing on supporting young people so they can envision a new Cambodia, envision a new world. But also one of our ambition is to get more Cambodian young people to join global conversation. So I think as a country, as Cambodia, as a country on the receiving end of the international support, international advice, I think 30-something years after that, I think it's about time where we also need to join global conversations about global issues that's relevant in the world as well. And having said that, I think this is actually one of the ambitions of our work is to support young people in the hope that they eventually can also discuss global events and shaping the futures of the world as well as the future of Cambodia. My name is Virak. I'm the founder of Future Forum. I do have multiple hats. I'm also a human rights activist. At one point, running a human rights organization. At this stage, it's a privilege to actually host you as our first guest. I couldn't think of any better guest on this podcast as a first guest to discuss all that's going on in the world.
Yeah.
Beside yourself, but also you and I, we chit chat quite a bit over the years. We became good friends, and I think we agree on too many things.
Possibly.
I'm not sure if that's a good thing for our conversation because we tend to agree on a lot of our views. I mean, we agree on a lot of the things we discuss over the years. So let me give the floor to you and let me start with your introductions of yourself. Before you say anything, I just want to point out you came from a very insignificant country. Tell me about insignificant. It's a tiny country called Luxembourg.
Wow.
So that's the background I know. So let's start with introductions. Who's Joe and what you are doing here, and where did you come from?
Where I'm coming from, the insignificant place. Well, that's quite a start right there. Well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is indeed Joe, and I'm here now a little bit over 2 years in the role of United Nations Resident Coordinator. In that function, I am responsible to coordinate the work of the UN country team. And the UN country team is all the UN entities that are active in Cambodia. We have 26 that are currently supporting the cooperation framework, so the agreement we have with the government in the work we do. I've been here before, so I worked here also 2007, 2010, and I actually visited the first time Cambodia in 1998. So while you can't be an expert by being here occasionally or for a few years, I have a pretty good sense on the way Cambodia has developed. I'm quite impressed by many things, and really, really personally very attached to the country as well. Not irrelevant, perhaps, to this discussion is that I have an adopted daughter from Cambodia as well.
That I did not know.
That you didn't know, who is now 16 and a half. Her name is Tida. And so I've been personally and professionally quite involved in Cambodia's development. It's a pleasure to be here as your first guest. Congratulations to this podcast series. I hope that this one will be successful, so that there's going to be many more. Right? But it's a privilege to be here as your first guest. So thank you. To me personally, now so insignificant. That stings, right? And also, I'm from Luxembourg, which is a tiny country.
But it's also the richest, or one of the richest countries.
It's right up there, yeah. So you have to look at some of the statistics, but usually it's in the top 1 or 2, maybe sometimes 3 in terms of GDP per capita. There's a reason for that, and actually quite a lot linked to initially migration, but then also how the economic wealth of a country can have a footprint much bigger than its national boundaries. Luxembourg is small. It has currently about 40,000 people only. But to make the point about that, its wealth initially was built based on migration from Italy into the steel industry. This was the late 1800s. And more recently, when you look at the statistics today, over half of the workforce of Luxembourg are foreigners, and over half of that commutes in and out of the country on a daily basis from the neighboring countries, Belgium, Germany, and France. So that explains the wealth. But more importantly, I think as a UN official, of course, you stand for broader values, if you wish. But being a Luxembourgian, if I can put on that hand for a moment, significant in the sense that I was a founding member of the EU and very much a believer in a multilateral system in an more connected global world. So that's at a personal level something that I want to use the word proud when it comes to your home nation. There's always a bit of a sensitive word, but I'm quite happy to see that Luxembourg is a country that continues to engage internationally based on multilateral values. So not so insignificant.
I spent some years in the US, and I was in my early years.
Yeah.
And one of the conversations, one of the things you realize when you left the country, when you left the US, is that the world are not thinking in the same way. So the conclusion that I drew from that, particularly when you left the country, when you left US, and actually looking back at the friends and the conversations you tend to have in the US, is very much, the US is very much secluded in a way, right? It's kind of a world of its own in some way, and there's something to say about smaller countries where you probably have to acknowledge the globe, because there's nothing that you do that could be either self-sufficient or in terms of security. You definitely need friends and allies and multilateralisms and various other instruments, particularly more international orders. Is that why you participated in the UN? Because you came from, you can see, you discuss, for example, the role of Luxembourg, a small country, in the broader schemes of supporting the EU, for example, right? The formations of the EU, but also, is that why you're passionate about the UN as a more global body in kind of coordinating different worlds issues?
Very interesting question. In an indirect way, initially, yes. When I started out, now firmly, yes. The observation about the United States, my wife is actually from the US, and I spent quite a few years living also in New York, serving at UN headquarters, a total of about 10, 11 years. So I know the US a little bit, and sure, in some sense secluded, but I think that's a comment you can make about many, many countries. Even small countries, when I look at some of the people I know in Luxembourg, the mind can be a very, very small place. in terms of the way you look at your life and the way you interact with society and the broader picture. Having said that, Luxembourg certainly became a founding member of the EU after the Second World War, because in all of its history, it's been occupied by pretty much everyone in Europe that ever, moved around. And in the last century, the two world wars are easily overrun within hours by our neighbors. So there was certainly a sense of vulnerability, and driven by building peaceful Europe, that Luxembourg joined that. Me personally, when I joined the UN in 1994, so a little bit over 30 years ago, I was driven by global environmental interests. So I did study earth sciences and physical geography with a focus on climate science, so over 30 years ago. I did my master's thesis in 92. I graduated in 92, which is when the Earth Summit happened in Rio de Janeiro, where sustainable development was coined. It was also the year the first IPCC report came out, so the first international report of all the scientists worldwide working on climate change. What does climate change mean for us? And I wanted to work internationally on global environmental issues. That was a little bit my background. And, I always joked when I was a teenager, I was basically a tree hugger, and my sort of awakening happened with Greenpeace when I was about 12, 13 years old.
Yeah.
But then, having joined the UN in 1994, I very quickly came to realize that you can't work on environment outside of development. If you want to protect this planet, you have to do it through sustainable development. And so I really enjoyed working and changing, so a little, broadening my outlook. And then, of course, as I understood more over the years about Universal Declaration for Human Rights, the UN values, multilateralism, how the global world actually works, the more personally I'm motivated and driven by that.
It's in similar way. I mean, in some way, I'm always passionate about human rights, and that's actually probably a bit more personally driven because of my background as a child refugee, a survivor of the Khmer Rouge. So, when we reflect back and coming from that disadvantaged background, you tend to be passionate about something deep down. Once you're starting to be more exposed to the work of human rights, I was really passionate. One of the things I realized through that work for many years, for about 10 years, is that you cannot disconnect the work on human rights just being advocacy on advocating for the values that everybody seems to acknowledge to be important for all of us, right, for all human beings. But you cannot disconnect that from development. You can't disconnect that to broader society. You can't connect that from religious practice, traditions, and culture. And so in some way, that's what's drawn me to our work at Future Forum, is to find connection, but also to look for simple ideas that could have broader impact. At the end of it is actually for the same kind of shared values as human rights. Having said that, now that you're working as a country, or as a representative of the UN in Cambodia, you're one of the most important men in the country.
Wow.
I've seen you shaking hands with really powerful and important figures, discussing a lot of big issues. Let me go back to the UN. The UN is a United Nations has a special place in the recent history of the country. As we know, Cambodia was the first country that received the UN peacekeeping mission, and a big one by all accounts. And there's also ongoing support since then. Right? It was known as UN Transitional Authority, UNTAC to Cambodia, which is acronym of it is UNTAC, UNTAC. What's your view of the UN roles in Cambodia so far? Success, criticism, things you would wish to see could have been done better. What's your view?
Well, I think, I would say that Cambodia, as far as its let me call it partnership, and let me explain a little bit in a moment why, with the UN as a success story. Having said that, you can always do things better. We need to be humble about the work we do. And we also need to recognize that at the end of the day, the development of a country, the future of a country, lies in the hands of the people of that country and their government. We can support, we can advise, we can maybe be catalytic, but it's not the UN that's gonna be the ones that basically get it done. And looking back, obviously, when UNTAC was here, the peacekeeping mission in the early 1990s, I hadn't even started with the UN yet, right? So I don't have first-hand experience. But by all accounts, looking back, it's been able to set a really strong foundation for the development Cambodia has seen since then, in terms of assisting in organizing the first democratic elections coming out of the war period, and helping drafting constitutions and things like that, in terms of setting up the initial, say, foundation on which then the government and Cambodian society can build its country. Now, if you look, 2025, what Cambodia has achieved on many fronts, extremely impressive, especially keeping in mind, and I want to underline that because a lot of observers that don't really know Cambodia's history so well forget how far it has to come back from. Some of these ministers that occasionally see refer to 79 as year zero, right? And over the years, of course, our role has changed. At the beginning, we had thousands of people here doing all sorts of things. And over the years, the role has become increasingly more advisory, more normative, more upstream in terms of policy support, and less implementation of large programs, less work on service delivery that we might have done in the 90s, but now there's no longer a need for us to do that. But that's the development side of things. Another two quick, I think, examples where Cambodia shines and has certainly a very important experience for the global community is one from a recipient of a peacekeeping mission in the early 90s. Short, like 15 years later or so, Cambodia started to become a contributor to peacekeeping missions around the world, is today recognized as a very well-respected contributor to peacekeeping missions. Just a week ago, we sent off the latest contingents of Cambodian peacekeepers to South Sudan, Lebanon, and Central African Republic. And but we also have to talk about international justice, transitional justice, and the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. So there's three very important experiences Cambodia has. One, developing very fast. Two, peacekeeping. And three, in terms of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal and national justice. Now, a lot of people criticize the court, but it's a really interesting example to look at and to learn from.
On that front, one of the things that I've always pushed in terms of Cambodia kind of foreign policies, in terms of where we stand, but what would be strategic. What's Cambodia? What's your advice in terms of Cambodia's foreign policy? You mentioned, for example, Cambodia as a responsible member of the UN, of the international peacekeeping mission, but also we're looking at, for example, demining efforts, right? Cambodia, not just a contributor, but also almost taking a lead in that front, right? Being known as sending deminers globally, supporting efforts to do that. How would you advise in terms of, if you were to look at, I don't know, name three topics that Cambodia can push for in terms of soft power, for example, our ability to drive, to lead, to be a global leader. What would be a three soft power topics that Cambodia could and should perhaps explore playing more of a leading role in the global arena? I'm certain that I think peacekeeping and demining probably was one of them.
Yeah, for sure. In terms of, the first part of that question, the advice we as the UN would give, of course, would be the advice of respecting international law, international humanitarian law, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all those principles that flow from that, because it's our job to support countries in working in that direction. I think the recent past has shown that Cambodia has been a very positive voice, and that has been recognized internationally when it came to some of the conflicts that you've seen speak. For example, the statements the government made regarding the Ukraine, and you mentioned the miners, and Cambodia sent some demining experts, I believe, to Poland to support the formation of Ukrainian deminers. Also, Cambodia hosted just at the end of last year the latest review conference of the Ottawa Convention to ban landmines. So that certainly is an area, I think, where it speaks with authority, with experience. Unfortunately, a very painful experience for the country in terms of
legitimacy, right?
With legitimacy, that's the right word.
We have the right
exactly.
we have the right and the
exactly
kind of to push back on and to push for the global efforts to eliminate landmines, for example. Yeah,
and expanding from that, I think what the government is absolutely right is when they keep stressing, you can't have peace without development. You can't have development without peace. So actually, this focus that you have to have peace, you have to find a way to bring fighting, opponents, whatever, in some shape or form to the table to build peace, in order for society to advance and to ensure the well-being of people. As UN, of course, what we add to that is you can't have peace or development without human rights.
Without
justice. Quote, without justice, without, to quote, I believe it was Kofi Annan, then Secretary General Kofi Annan, some 20, 25 years ago, would have said that, if I remember correctly. So demining that peace narrative, I think, is very important. Soft power, most definitely, therefore, also related to peacekeeping. But I think more importantly, even the own experience on how the country has come back. Again, we can criticize, and some people do, but Cambodia has its own path, has its experience, and we need to look at it. We need to learn from it. And what I really welcome is that the government last year announced the establishment of I don't know exactly what shape it's going to take, but a permanent institution with the support of the government to house the archives of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. And if you look at the offices now where they are, it's every day packed with students. It's a resource library, etc. And I think that experience of international justice in a hybrid court, the issue that they did on victims outreach, etc., there's so much the international community can learn from that, which I think is extremely important. And I really congratulate the government to deciding to set this up, and I hope we can support it and make it truly a center that can merge in the region or maybe even globally, as you might connect it with other countries that have these kind of experiences, including genocide. And maybe a final point is what is really appreciative in this international sphere is that Cambodia is very active, for example, on women peacekeepers. So it's very, very much committed to meet, well, they have already exceeded the UN's targets in terms of the percentage of peacekeepers that should be women, and actively working on increasing it even further. And this narrative in terms of women, peace and security, and that at the end of the day, you get much better peace, more sustainable peace when you have also women involved, is something that Cambodia is actively leading on. But in all of that, I think should actively be more outspoken about. I think that soft power is there, and many see it. I'm not sure it's really exercised yet the way it could. Of course, that takes time.
You raise a very interesting point, which is actually that peace, development, and human rights is not one or the other. It doesn't. You don't choose. It has to go together. And one of the most challenging job, or one of the most challenging work in my own role, was actually trying to convince that supporting human rights does not mean less development. It could actually mean better development. It could mean more sustained, more equal development. Could then contribute to more sustained peace, but also better social cohesion among the Cambodian people, instead of actually leading to potential classism or class divisions or any any accusations of such, right, or perceptions of such, and that is actually one of the most important things. Now, talking about one or the other, I'm going to look at another mega trend, and you don't have to mention by name, but I will. The rise of Donald Trump in the U.S. And it's not Trump's rise as a mega trend globally, but what's Trump's rise mean is this notion that the world seems to be shifting toward populism. And populism is never ideal if we are going to push for a global or an international order that is based on rule of law, that's based on cooperations and collaboration. Because populism tend to also leads to nationalism and and divisions among the border, but often leads to potential harmful ideas within the border. I mean, you look at the U.S., for example, racism could be on the rise again, where progress has been made for the past hundreds of years. I mean, you can see the ups and downs, but in general, I mean, racism in the U.S. has improved significantly, relatively compared to the past. But that rise again could means divisions among societies within the U.S., but also globally, populism could be a thing. And then there's another questions of people asking, well, small states, small countries like us, Cambodia, to choose between the U.S. or China, which I think is a false way of framing that kind of understanding, that kind of question. And again, going back to this notion that you don't have to choose one or the other, but also why do we seeing in such a two-way zero-sum global issues? What's your take on the rise of Trump and the rise of populism as a potentially a mega trend that will affect globally? What is that? What does that really mean for us, a small state like Cambodia? Also, maybe you can touch on potential trade war a bit and the implications. What do we need to understand, and what could we do?
Okay, so we have the rest of the day, right? Because
we have the rest of the year.
No, look, this is, I think, something that extremely pertinent question, and let me preface this by saying there's obviously much smarter thinkers and academics and researchers, intellectuals that spend their whole day on these questions. But from where I sit, so 30 years in the UN, in many different countries, and from a UN perspective, we certainly have seen a trend away from multilateralism, from challenging international cooperation systems, from challenging some of those universal human rights. They're called universal for a reason. A lot of people say, oh, this is a Western concept that doesn't apply to us. Well, that's actually not true. And go back to the scholars. They're called universal for a reason. But these kind of values are certainly under attack. And one of those drivers, I think, is populism. And obviously not going to comment now specifically on the US or Trump, but we see similar trends in a number of countries. And I think we need to unpack why that is. At a time where we ought to be working together much more, because we are faced with so many global problems that no single country, for whatever populist views they might take, will solve. Take climate change, which is by all accounts the most significant threat in terms of humanity, unless we were ending up in a nuclear war of some sort. Take pandemics. I think COVID-19 has shown us that borders mean nothing for viruses. People forget that 50 million people were killed at the beginning of the 20th century in what was called at that time, I think, the Spanish flu. Nothing against Spain, but I think that's the common name. The next pandemic is around the corner, right? Especially also that since we get deeper and deeper into nature and increase the friction point between the animal kingdom and humanity, where some of those jumps happen in terms of future pandemics. Look at the globally connected economy. Look at the digital economy. Look at AI. thinking that any country by itself could solve any of that is foolish at best. And yet there's a lot of, we see a lot of forces going against that international cooperation. And I think the populism might partially be rising out of the fact that we haven't been able anymore to make our economies, our societies work for the lower class and the middle class. If you look at inequality rising in many countries, if you look at statistics in some of the quote developed countries, where current young generations are the first ones since the Second World War that are going to be less well off than their parents, that idea that we just keep progressing is simply gone in many countries. And I think we need to recalibrate really on how we work for everyone in our nations. And that can only happen at the end of the day if you bring it back to the values and the rights of everyone and really focus on sustainability and equality. For Cambodia, what it means, a trade war would be bad for Cambodia because so much of its economy depends on exports, 40% still today, roughly into the US. Cambodia also is looking into LDC graduation. So we just started a 5-year period. By 2029, year end 2029, Cambodia will graduate from LDC status. It will have a little grace period, but it will lose eventually in the early 2030s its trade preferences. How do you prepare for that in a country where still a lot of development needs to take place to reach that high income target of the government by 2050? So all of that is really complex, and certainly Cambodia, being small, needs to be connected in the region and globally. It can't do it on its own, and it shouldn't be forced to choose. Obviously, or if it chooses on its own, if you wish, free will, like every sovereign nation should. Having said all of that, I do hope that this populism that we see is a phase and not a megatrend.
Is Cambodia being asked to choose now by either China, the US, with Trump administrations over the next 4 years? Are we going to be asked, and what's your view on that? And if so, how could Cambodia respond to that?
Look, that's a tough one, and I don't really have an answer to that because these are discussions that I'm really not privy to. Maybe what I've observed the last 2 years. So I arrived here 3 weeks before the ASEAN summit that took place here in Cambodia, the 22 ASEAN summit. What I've seen the last 2 years, and also with the government after the elections, is a willingness to engage all partners and welcome all partners and have a good relationship with all partners. And there's, of course, certain narratives out there that Cambodia is forced to choose, or China is too dominant, or the US doesn't want that, etc., etc. You read all of that. I'm not part of those discussions, so I don't have an opinion on that specifically. But what I do see is that over the last 2 years, the engagement with these countries has improved. Mm-hmm. You had, for example, in the US, several visitors, high-level ranking visitors coming through. Now, I don't know what policy the Trump presidency and government will have towards Cambodia. Japan has elevated its collaboration with Cambodia to strategic partnership. Australia is very much engaged. Korea is. So I see Cambodia trying to basically just being a good partner to everyone because it recognizes that in the end of the day, it's in their interest to do that. But of course, it is also going to be subject to big geopolitical dynamics that it can't control by itself. And so I think, therefore, close integration with ASEAN is probably very important, and playing that very strong international, lawful, respectful card in terms of position when it comes to these issues, being that voice. And again, you mentioned earlier legitimacy, having gone through a war that was very largely driven by outside forces as well, and coming back from a devastating, Khmer Rouge period, having built peace, there is a legitimacy and I think a voice that Cambodia can amplify perhaps as well. A bit more in this line of soft power we talked earlier.
So one of my criticism of the UN, particularly.
I'm sure there's many.
I have a lot. But
well, let's start with the first one.
But I'm terrible because I've actually criticizing a lot of people, but also I don't belong in any camps.
Yeah.
And so that could be a good thing, but also that could be a bad thing. But one of my criticism in the roles of the UN in Cambodia is that, and this is not just the role of the UN, but also the role of the international community, is that Cambodia has actually been seen as a Western project or as a UN project. And that's in the sense that I think Cambodia being taught to wait for help. We got help, significant help. We transition away from factionalism, internal conflicts, whether it's violence conflicts or non-violence conflicts, but the level of conflicts and distrust among Cambodian people was really, really high. But also when we move away from that, we're moving into a more rule-based governance structure or infrastructure, participations by different people. It's never perfect. There's always a lot of ups and downs. There's definitely a lot too many downs that I care I want to see. But at the same time, while there's a lot of progress, the one thing that I think needs to happen, and that is this concept called agency. Where can Cambodia starting to own the process, to own decision-making process, right? To not Cambodia as just the government, but also the Cambodian people, particularly young people, where they feel that they have some agencies, they have self-determination. At least they can participate in what's going on in the country, but also hopefully participate in what's going on in the world. Some level of agency, so we can no longer believe that we have a project, but we are on our own right as a nation, as a country that can determine different things, right? The foreign policies, but more importantly, at least decisions and the direction and the vision for the country. So when we look at, for example, in terms of this changes in the global dynamic with the rise of China, the U.S. has been moving away a bit from the global infrastructure that basically the U.S. has sustained for almost a century, and they seems to be on the attack, or at least the UN, the international mechanism has been under attack. But I felt that the discussion on where Cambodia needs to focus on is actually that agencies, and I've seen agencies in the sense that Cambodia is actually trying to expand collaborations and partnership with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, and it's very intriguing to see. But what's your advice for the Cambodian people, and what do they, particularly the young Cambodian people who say, there might be there might be anxiety about all of these news that we discussed. What's your advice for them? What they need to focus on, and what should they understand, and where do they sit in terms of agencies, the ability to have self-determination or to contribute to a lot of our discussions?
And so the criticism on UN in that was where? What was
the criticism is actually this: once you brought something, right, you carry the weight of that and the expectation that will continue, and there needs to be a pass on where that shift needs to happen, where young people, Cambodian people, needs to say, okay, now I have to own the process. And you can use the UN or other support, international support, for advice, for in terms of support, in terms of skill support, or in terms of other infrastructure support, particularly on the global level. But what needs to happen is we need to be the one that discuss about the direction of the country.
So, not a big one, this podcast is full of very big questions. How do I answer this? I think, again, I wasn't here when UNTAC, the mission, started, but I would perhaps not agree that Cambodia is a Western project, even though, of course, through the UN and then a lot of bilateral engagement, a lot of the support, at least initially, came from the West, the developed world. But it is strongly based on these universal values that, as such, are not actually Western. And let's be honest, no country so far has actually been able to live up to all of these values. And as you know, we have, since 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals that are also universal, apply to each country, that are rights-based, and that no country is on track to achieve right now. The target year is 2030. And I think you certainly have seen a shift, I think, in society over those last 35 years, where the agency, so to speak, and national ownership has ever been more important and ever increasing. Now, at the outset, the way the UN operates, as directed by our member states, remember, the UN is not a self-thinking, independent body. It is governed by the member states that give us the mandate, the instructions, etc., of what we're supposed to do in the country, how we're supposed to operate. And everything we do to development is based as a foundation on national ownership. That is, of course, often more easy to say than to implement. What I would say to young Cambodians, if it was one thing, I would say, lift your head up, look outside, look left and right, understand how things work. And I was going to say fight, it sounds like we're in a fight, but be active contributor to realizing that sustainable vision that we have for the world. Recognize your rights within that, because you have rights, but also recognize your obligations as a citizen, because you have obligations as well, and work for those. And I think this journey towards full agency and full ownership, and I want to repeat what I said earlier, no country is ever going to develop with outside help. Yep. It has to come from within. And hopefully what we have seen is, over those last 35 years, a big shift. I certainly do believe that some of the outside observers or partners of Cambodia sometimes are a little bit blinded by the shiny buildings in Phnom Penh and don't understand its history, and are a little bit too much still in the mode of, let me tell Cambodia what it should do. Cambodia is also smaller than some of the other countries. It's sometimes held to a different standard by the international community than other countries. I think there is somewhat introspection that has to happen by its partners to treat Cambodia in that sense equally, not by letting them off where criticism is warranted, but recognizing that we need to support the government, the national government, the society, and Cambodians overall to realize that vision. So I hope that answers partially your question.
And it does, but also when we are discussing
raises other questions.
When we're discussing foreign aids, and we're discussing the impact and the implication, but also the byproducts, the unintended consequences, and the dynamics of actually how things get implemented on the ground. So when I said actually when I raised the Western project is more about perception and the byproduct of foreign aids. Well, foreign aid is now in the conversation, usually in the conversations now with what's going on with USAID. A lot of the changes globally, actually, not just from the US, globally, I think foreign aid will probably going to be going through a lot of changes over the next 4 or 5 years, particularly for a country like Cambodia, as you rightly said. I think we are graduating in the next 5 years or so. The implication will be huge. So investment, trades, privileges, and also foreign assistance, all of that will change. And so I think it's not just whether Cambodia was treated as a Western project, but perceptions of that from other countries, but also from Cambodian people themselves, is actually going to have much more impact on how we get involved in discussion. And my perceptions of this, or my understanding of this, is actually, if we are going to truly understand Cambodia, but also to support more agency in terms of discussion, and to understand us, where we sit, we have to really join the global conversation. The more we join global conversation about things that's going on in the world, but also then, and also what we can do about it, we'll then look at solutions for global issues. The more we look at solutions for global issues, the more we understand who we are, where we sit among everyone else, right, among the world. But also we'll then realize actually we have more solutions, more. That's the conversation. And Foreign Aid, I think, we're probably going to require a separate podcast and then I'm going to move on to one of the phenomenons I think often not discussed as much as I like, and one of the things I'm always pushing for, and that is demographic. People, right? So people, and that is, if you're looking at now the global conversation. I remember 20 years ago, 30 years ago, about when the world become overpopulated and everybody is having too many children and all of that, and all of a sudden the conversations in the Western world and in the richer world has changed now to how to get people to have more children, right? Because fewer babies is the end of the world, or dooms the world as we know it. It used to be having too many children dooms the world as we know it, and now having few children dooms the world as we know it. But I think out of all of the country, Cambodia has seen significant, much farther, much more changes with our people demographic than most, because of because what's happened during the decades of conflicts and wars and starvations and killings. As we know, we tend to refer to 1979 as year zero, a new beginning for a rebirth of the country. What that means is in the 1980s afterward is we have witnessed a baby booming generations after that, and now Cambodia is described by most people as a country of young people. How are you? What's your views on Cambodia in terms of our population, where we stand, and how has that benefited us, or at least the dynamic, the changes in the changes in population, the dynamic of that, how has that shaped politically, economically, culturally, and from there on we can discuss where do we go from here in the next 10, 20 years.
A lot of stuff in there again. So, there's migration, there's population growth, there is Cambodia as a young country. Where do I start? Which one of the three do I start with? Statistically speaking, Cambodia is still a young country, but of course, eventually that will not be the case, right? Cambodia will. So I think still the largest part of Cambodian society today is, by definition, youth. I think a mistake we are making, all of us, is that our time frames are not long enough. And we talk about youth dividend and it's a young country, et cetera, and we keep thinking in 3, 4, 5-year project cycles or legislative mandates or funding cycles, what have you. And then suddenly we wake up and go, oh, the birth rate is below 2. We are below replacement rate suddenly, or other things are happening. And I think what the challenge we all have is, as we've worked so diligently on what is immediately in front of us in terms of problems to solve and opportunities to seize, that in parallel we can project forward and look at what it means. And I think for Cambodia's youth, to me, what is interesting, having worked here before, I think that baby boom generation came into the workforce, because big change for me when I was here in 2007, They weren't young people like the colleagues here that are now, taping this podcast. Now where you go, that generation is everywhere in the workforce. So there's a massive shift, and it's a generation that has not lived through the trauma of the Khmer Rouge period and the war before that, or the 80s, which was a very difficult period for Cambodia as well. Certainly marked by it because it's also societal trauma, etc. But very different life experience and very different expectations, I think, for the future that you need to project as partners and as government forward for the long term. And when it comes to population growth, then I think what many countries are missing, in particular, also in this region, when you look at the demographics, for example, of South Korea, you look at Japan, that are well below replacement rate, some of the lowest birth rates in the world. China is a bit of a different story. It's also an aging and shrinking society, but of course with the one-child policy that had a different origin than Korea and Japan. And you see this trend that every country, the more it develops, the less children these societies have. To my knowledge, not a single country that faced this problem has been able to reverse it. No matter what policy you put in place in terms of more maternity leave, paternity leave, childcare, what have you, it doesn't come back. And something we're really missing in that discussion is, why do women choose to have less babies? And part of that issue is gender equality. Why do so many women decide also not to get married anymore? So now, I'm personally not someone who believes in all these, traditional family values, what have you. I mean, you can have your own views on that. Fact is, all these societies in Europe, etc., are shrinking. We're going to shrink very, very soon. And we haven't understood or looked carefully at the gender dynamics underlying that and the role of women in society. And as I said, nobody has been able to reverse that. And I don't think anyone will. And so then it comes to migration.
Yes.
Because I think these countries will need to open up to migration or face potentially serious economic decline because they can no longer fill the jobs that need to be filled.
So and it's kind of they're going to be knocking on the doors of developing countries, particularly countries.
Well, you see that already in many countries.
With Vietnam,
look at the Philippines.
Vietnam, the Philippines, Cambodia, absolutely. Sending out. There's higher demand for workforce from countries with younger populations. Yeah. So Cambodia will be under pressure to send workers, or at least there will be a lot of Cambodian young people who want to migrate for economic opportunities elsewhere. Is that a good thing? Is that how should we understand this external migration of young workforce? It's not brain drain, but it's definitely muscle drain for a country, for developing countries, particularly countries that probably need more young people like us. What's the implication of the external migration of young people, in your view?
So, I think this might sound a bit counterintuitive. I think, first of all, migration is a very, very good thing. And let me explain why, because, of course, it's not without its challenges and risks. First of all, it has always happened. People have always migrated for opportunities. And migration can be extremely beneficial for both the country that receives the migrant in terms of that country's development. I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the Italians coming to Luxembourg into the steel industry, for instance. It can be a very good thing for the country they are from because they are sending remittances back. They still invest back into the country where they grew up in, where they might have family ties. And of course, someone who migrates out of economic needs is very different from someone who leaves a war-torn country, everything has been destroyed, etc. So not all migration is equal, of course. And we're talking about migration, not about refugees. So two different things. And we see today that many countries, you mentioned Vietnam, you mentioned the Philippines, look at the South Asian workers that go to the Middle East, for example. These countries couldn't function without migrants. I think certain health systems in Europe would collapse if we wouldn't have foreign workers or migrants in those systems, right? The trick is that you make migration formal, you make it safe, you make it organized. And even today, you have plenty of Cambodians in Thailand, some legal, some illegal. So Cambodians are on the move, in the country, outside of the country. And I think what we, as you know, from a longer term perspective, what you want to do is, in the short term, make sure that the migration, as I said, is safe, is organized, is formal. And also that we try to support, something the UN, for example, is doing here with the Ministry of Labor. What skills does Cambodia need to develop to become a high-income country by 2050? Where can we send migrants? The UN doesn't send them, but how can we help migrants be in sectors where they gain skills that in return might be beneficial if they come back? Right? So there's all sorts of aspects to it that need to first of all recognized for its positive impacts, and that can be sort of be improved. We need to make sure that it is risk-free, that you don't have trafficking, etc. The second thing is, you talked about muscle drain and brain drain. People leave, not because, some people leave their countries because they want to do something else. Most people, migrants, leave out of necessity because they don't have the opportunities back home that they seek. And so the challenge or the goal for the government and society in general, for Cambodia, has to be to build a country where people want to stay. And perhaps in the medium term, where people return. And you see very poor countries that they are bleeding people. And eventually it's tipping back, where some people go out, they get educated, but they now start finding opportunities, and they come also back out of a sense of commitment. So you see a little bit of that happening, but eventually you want a society where if people want to stay, they can stay and live a peaceful, productive life where they can pursue their ambitions.
So there's two things that we discussed, and one of the things that governments, particularly development governments, the developed world, seems to be panicking on the issues of declining birth rate, and to I guess my perception as an economist is that to me is a good thing, for the world, with declining population, of declining birth rate in some of these Western countries. Because if you look at climate change, for example, per capita consumption of carbon, of everything, they are much higher at developing world than any other poor country. You look at any poor countries. But also what is really intriguing is actually the economic model on sustained rise, right? The government spending is always projected to rise. So the panic is actually the inability to collect as much money as people planning to do. So, or governments were planning to do. And maybe the only solution is actually to come to terms with these new realities and have a different plan for the future. Maybe a declining taxation, but also a more efficient government might be the only solution. But you look at the fabric of societies, and I'm looking at the case of Cambodia, and I witnessed over the past 20 years, massive transformation, a lot of migration, and Cambodia is definitely, by all account, people on the move. Everybody seems to be moving. It's very few people that actually stay where they live where their hometown, right, within their hometown. There's a lot more internal migrations happening, and the assumption is actually is a one-way street where the rural populations are moving to the city, whereas now it's starting to be saturated, where there's a lot of the shift where you're starting to see provincial rural people moving to another province, for example, right? And there's vice versa, and also we're starting to see some of that change. But whatever it is everybody seems to be moving somewhere, externally, internally, and I think one of the conversation, one of the things we need to discuss is actually for Cambodia to actually become a high upper middle income country. Cambodia needs to be a destination where not just our people need to stay or wanting to stay.
Others are coming.
There will be a time where outgoing and incoming seems to be a regular and normal thing.
Yeah.
So it's not just one way street.
Yeah.
That's going to be something that's happening. In your views, will that happen, and when will that happen? And
When?
could that be a good thing? But also, what my
Yeah.
view is, in terms of actually Cambodia becoming a rich country, we're probably going to need more digital nomads, for example, incoming, right, in
Yeah.
migration,
Yeah.
where we are not just worrying about brain drain. We might still have people who's leaving, but also we actually might gain. So brain gain and muscle gain might be the futures of the next the next phase of
Generation.
the next phase of our development. And what's your perceptions on this internal migration? So one of the even when we look at, for example, the fabric of societies, right? One of the some of the things we touch on when I was working at human rights is looking at, for example, where a lot of the able, so you look at couples who have children, the children would then be left with their grandparents to take care of, where the able bodies or the able families migrate to work, and there's a lot of that kind of disconnect in terms of generational connect. So there's a lot of these issues that we need to come to terms with and grapple with. How can we deal with that, and what are the consequences or potential consequences of these changes that's happening mainly due to migration, but it's affecting the economy mostly for the positive, politically, as you've seen over the past 15 years or so, but also culturally and traditionally. I mean, you look at traditions and culture, there's a massive change in Cambodia over the past 15 years.
Well, thank you for yet another very complicated question with many aspects to it. But
That's why is why you're our first guest.
No, but I mean the questions are spot on, because obviously these things are all connected, right? You can't separate them out. But so you touched on climate and again, of course, of migration and the way Cambodia positions itself in an interconnected world and so on. So perhaps to start with again is, Cambodia, and this is true for every country. I think any country that thinks they can do it on their own is mistaken. We talked about some of the challenges earlier, be that climate change, be that health, security, be that trade and commerce and all of that. We are so interwoven. The scary part, I think, and let's talk a moment about climate change, because I said earlier that it's probably the biggest threat we are facing as humanity, unless we have nuclear war at some point, hopefully not, or a pandemic that, wipes all of us out. Climate change is really an issue. And you talked about the planet. We far exceed what we call planetary boundaries in terms of the resource use that our current economic model actually demands. And we're getting very, very dangerously close to certain tipping points in terms of climate change. It's just some research came out again last year, where once we cross those, we face massive problems. And just take one of those, sea level rise. If the Greenland ice sheet melts, and of course it will not melt overnight, but it is very close to the tipping point, the ice in the Greenland ice sheet is going to contribute to 6 to 7 meters of sea level rise over a long period of melting. But that's enormous impact on all coastal areas. Look at what kind of infrastructure, cities, etc., we have around the world in coastal areas, right? So there is no way but to work together. And Cambodia, you mentioned earlier, its voice. I hope it can become, ever more on its legitimacy, feel empowered to share this view and this voice, but also then do its part and its share. And so I think it needs to work on safe and fair migration. It needs to deal with trafficking of Cambodians in and out, or foreigners in and out of Cambodia. A positive, you mentioned, digital nomads and so on. Cambodia very early on decided to be a very open country. I think it's one of the easiest countries to come as a foreigner in terms of visas, business visas, staying. It allowed from the outset, I think, 100% foreign direct investment in businesses that started here. So it made very open choices, which I think have significantly positively contributed to Cambodia's development, but of course it's not without challenges. And part of this is also, you talked about traditions and culture of a society. I'm coming from a country where half of the population are foreigners. What does it mean to be a Luxembourgian? As a UN person, of course, I think if you try to preserve your culture, you're basically contributing to its death. Because culture always changes society, always changes traditions, always change. And it's being enriched. And I think you have to try to find a balance that allows also a young Cambodia to move forward. Silly example, but traditionally Cambodia didn't have rappers. We just did some work with a young Cambodian rapper, a woman who's done some work for International Women's Day. So we need to find ways to embrace these changes, bring the young people, not forgetting where we're coming from. Of course, you want to maintain that link and that richness, but it evolves always. And if Cambodia aims to continue to benefit from that international aspect that it very much is, by attracting maybe on one end of the spectrum digital nomads, but on the other end of the spectrum, attracting more foreign direct investment from a more diverse set of partner sources, you need a rule-based society. You need rule of law. You need a judicial system that works. You need a taxation system that works. You need, if you want to continue exporting into Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, you need to meet certain labor standards and environmental rights, food safety issues. So you need to keep working on those norms and standards that at the end of the day are not set by Cambodia, but determine Cambodia's ability to be connected in this world and continue exporting. And as such, to switch back, Cambodia to be have a stronger voice in these discussions of regional or global cooperation. There is, of course, an imbalance in that. It is very difficult for Cambodia, with its history and its size, to participate in every global mechanism at the level of a United States or Canada or Germany or Australia, who can throw many more people at the same issue with lots more expertise than Cambodia currently can. So you need to be selective, I think, in terms of where you see your priorities. But I think to have that future where Cambodia can benefit from this, as you say, coming and going, it needs to be rule-based.
It needs to also be very livable.
It needs to be very livable, yes.
And so on that front, I mean, we're going to just touch further a bit on climate change.
Yeah.
Cambodia is a poor country and smaller country. What's your recommendations in terms of our climate change strategy? So climate change is happening, it's coming, but also the impact of that will be significant. It already has already been significant globally, but also in terms of agriculture output, potential rise of the sea, just the effect on crops, on the health of people. Of the past week or so, we've seen the level of unhealthy air, for example. Where should we invest our limited resources, and where should our efforts go?
Well, we are currently supporting the government, range of other development partners on developing NDC 3.0, as we call it. So NDC, National Determined Contribution, basically Cambodia's climate strategy that each country submits to the Climate Change Convention process. By the end of this year, every country is invited to update its 5-year strategy. So right now we're working on what's going to happen 26, 7, 8, 9, and 2030. So the answer will lie in there. So we'll see how ambitious we are. For Cambodia, I think there is an overwhelmingly positive narrative with enormous gains, with the caveat that it will depend what the global community does. If the global community manages to come together where it needs to be, And we need to recognize that Cambodia's contribution to climate change, Cambodia's emissions are minuscule and frankly irrelevant in terms of what's happening globally with the climate. And so there's one narrative where Cambodia does everything and yet suffers greatly. Because as a world community, we might not get where we need to be, which is as close as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Where I see the advantages, though, so let's split this into two: adaptation and mitigation. On the mitigation front, even though I say that Cambodia is contributing very little, it should accelerate as fast as possible away from fossil fuels. I mean, already over 60% are renewable, mostly hydro. The government stated the goal to go to 70%, I think, by 2030, for reasons of doing its share on reducing emissions, but also in terms of an economic driver. It should go full renewable as fast as possible. Embrace household solar, work in the resilience of its grid and a decentralized grid because it's more shock resistance for the future. Significantly lower the energy prices for its industry to remain competitive as well vis-a-vis of big neighbors. So I think there's a very positive economic beneficial case to be made in terms of investing heavily and as fast as possible in energy. I would slow down on hydro because we don't fully understand the impact of hydro on the rivers and the Tonle Sap. Fish stocks have fallen 90%. Cambodia lives on fish, inland fisheries, number one protein source of Cambodians. Stocks have gone down 90%. Part of that is climate change, because it also depends on migration patterns of fish. With more climate change, you have more irregular flood and drought cycles. Dams interfere with migration of fish. Most of Cambodia's inland fish species, understand, are migratory species. And of course, depending on how new climate change, we might get into the whole Mekong, Tonle Sap reverse flow over the next decades. So that's a big risk. So we need to be careful about what we do on hydro there. And there again, of course, international cooperation, because Laos, China, Cambodia are the only ones doing hydro. It should stop deforestation and go formal on the carbon markets for forestry. I think in the long term, Cambodia can make way more money on the carbon markets to keep the trees standing and growing than cutting them. There is still enough there to actually make a difference rather quickly. And then, of course, it needs to invest in its living environment. Heat stress will become significant in the decades to come. Our urban centers are not prepared for what that means. We don't have enough green space, enough shade, and enough also resilient infrastructure. So largely, Cambodia's story will be one of adaptation to what's coming anyway. But in order to attract also international finance to support adaptation investments, it's got to be and continue to be a leader also on the mitigation front and go renewable. And implement what it has done as one of the first countries in Asia, its 2050 carbon neutrality strategy. So go full in. With the caveat, it depends what the global community does, but you got to lead by example and do your part to make sure Cambodians have as little impact as possible, including having a livable environment. And that means better urban planning. It means more resilient infrastructure. It means investing in nature and forestry and protecting your river systems and your fish stocks.
Where do you see, in terms of, I look at the issues of not just climate change, but also the global economies, the changing natures of global economy. Technology is actually, there's a lot of discussions on Industry 4.0, artificial intelligence now, almost a reality. I do not see it as a reality as yet, because it's basically doing a lot of chats instead of actually move beyond that. But where do you see Cambodia's economic drivers? What will drive the Cambodian economies in the next 20 years? I think in the past you look at agriculture, as the main driver. Um, Manufacturing, particularly garment industry, garment factories, basically creating a lot of factories jobs. But what's the next factory jobs for Cambodia? Where are we moving into in the next 20 years?
I wish I had a crystal ball.
What do you advise your what do you advise your adopted daughters if she's going to remain in Cambodia?
I take the fifth here. I'm not an economist. Look, I mean that's the big question. I think all of us haven't quite. Don't want to say all of us. That's obviously not true. But I certainly don't pretend to understand what AI is going to do to the world economy and societies. And it changes by the week, right? I mean, a month ago, ChatGPT was the thing of everything, and then suddenly China releases something.
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek, and the whole narrative changes. So I have no doubt it can drive enormous discoveries and benefits, but I'm not, an AI expert. To come more specific to your question, agriculture needs to be modernized, and I think Cambodia has some products with the right investment value chains. It can build significant markets for a few of those products, but I don't think it will have a growth in people employed or living of it. Garment is probably maxed out in terms of the number of people working in that sector. Construction, seems to have been flat the last few years. It's hard to see how that suddenly becomes a huge driver for the job growth the country needs to graduate. And, we talked about the migraines, right? There's millions of Cambodians that go out for them to stay here. Tourism certainly has growth potential, I think quite significantly, also as other areas of the country become more accessible, including high-end tourism, things in terms of culture. When you just look at, people go to Angkor Wat, but you look at the Temple of River here and around, could do cultural circuits. There's still some very interesting biodiversity. If we were able to protect some of our landscapes and forests, very much high-income tourists coming into the country. Not huge numbers, but those are niche markets that can be very useful. And I think probably in the short term, it's expanding manufacturing in other sectors like automotive, solar, electronics that is currently happening already, trying to be competitive with neighbors in terms of labor cost, energy costs, and other things. I don't know where new sectors then would be, because it comes back then to you have to have an educated society, a skilled society. I think the government is right to put this massive emphasis on skills development, on TVET, also education. 1.5 million, I think, is the target in this legislative period for TVET. It's a bit like a chicken and an egg, right? You have to have the jobs for people to apply to them, but you also have to have the skills to be able to apply to them. And, is the business coming? You have the jobs, the skills are not there, and so on. Again, there's economists that think about this day in, day out. But there's a long way to go, right? I mean, I think only about a third of Cambodians graduates from high school. And so if you want to look at the digital future, where you have young entrepreneurs suddenly doing things that go beyond Cambodia's borders, you need educated and skilled people. You need language skills. You need programming skills. I think there's a big gap on STEM education right now in Cambodia as well. And so I think before necessarily only worrying where the jobs are coming from, I think we need to also worry very, very significantly about increasing and improving our education outcomes. There's some work on the way, I understand, in bringing more coding jobs into Cambodia as well. And then perhaps last but not least, and this might seem a bit fatalistic or simplistic, create a rule-based environment where investment is incentivized, where people can do their work, where they have the ability to connect. We had discussions in the past in Cambodia about privacy laws around data, about an internet gateway. If you want to be part of the digital economy, you have to get those equations right. You cannot shut the country off if you want to be a country where young Cambodians engage digitally, right? So all of these things, I think you need an open society that is rule-based again, and fair in that sense.
So we're discussing about
So
AI.
I'm not answering a question where it's coming from. Simply, I don't know.
Well, I think we both agree. I think in conversations over the years, over the months, that at the end of it, we're probably going to be focused on the most boring non-AI issues. Whether we're going to have trees lining up the cities, or we're going to have sidewalks, or we're going to have better rule of law. Equal competitions, which actually going to generate more competitiveness, allowing Cambodian firms and businesses to compete globally, and as a main drivers of the economy. One of the things I think we both also needs to be I think agree, and there's something that I think missing in the conversations on AI is that we're never going to be a contributor in terms of actually competitive in the space of AI. But we're going to be the end users, the end consumers of AI, and that means the skill set that young people will eventually need is actually analytical skills, the ability to analyze, the ability to actually make use of technologies, the ability to actually manipulate technologies to service, hopefully, for human rights cause and values and humanities as a whole. But that's my understanding of the way we should be viewing whether it's AI or other technologies, and that is, can a population of Cambodia, particularly younger population, can they get the ability to understand and then manipulate and make use of it to serve what we value, the purposes we want. So that's the thinking. So I would push you on the as a conclusion, last part of our last segment of our conversation. Are you optimistic for Cambodia, and are you also optimistic for the world? Or are you pessimistic?
Okay, before
you have the right to be pessimistic if you are, but
okay. So before I answer, before I reveal if I'm an optimist or a pessimist, personally for the world and or Cambodia, let me actually, if you allow me to go back to what you just said about AI and young people and so on. The little that I've been reading and listening to in terms of sort of thinkers around AI. Now, the narrative that AI will wipe us outside, I don't understand enough about it in terms of how sentient it can become, and whether it will indeed go after humanity. So that narrative aside, I think AI will have tremendous benefits, and you already see some of it emerging. And so what you hear and read is indeed that young people need to be ever better equipped to use, manipulate, query those tools. And something that seems to be recurring right now is become super smart in how to formulate prompts that you feed into these AI interfaces. Again, I'm not the expert. So I don't know if this is a phase, and that will be overtaken by something else, soon enough. I mean, if AI is what it is, I guess at some point you don't have to prompt it anymore, because you don't need to have particular skills for it. I don't know. We'll see where that ends. But I think the point here is that for young people, what is demanded from you is becoming ever more complex. When I grew up, you learned the trade, or yes, you went to university, but you were planning for, a career in one path. And I think the world is much more dynamic now and much less predictable. And young people will need ever more skills compared to certainly what we were dealing with. But the flip side is they are exposed to ever more complexity and influence. And I think what I wanted to mention is, we haven't touched on this in this podcast when it comes to young Cambodians, the impact of misinformation, disinformation, the mental health crisis we see emerging around the world among teenagers in terms of social media use. Related to populism, we talked earlier. Science is no longer science, it appears. Facts are no longer facts, right? I can choose to believe as opposed to actually base my decision making on science. All of that, I think, is a massive, massive challenge, potentially a very dangerous, if we're talking about megatrends, that we really need to get a handle on and channel more positively. I'm not anti-technology at all. I'm not anti-social media at all. It's got to be regulated. It's got to be channeled in a way where some of those risks are minimized and some of those that benefit greatly from what you have now actually are being held to account. So I just wanted to throw that in there in terms of the previous discussion. Now, am I an optimist? Yes. That's the short answer. The somewhat longer answer is, in this job, you have to be. You cannot be a good partner to, of course, as United Nations, our primary partner. No, we are here sent by member states to support the government, in this case, Cambodia, the Cambodian government, in achieving the SDGs. That's our primary role. You can't do this job if you're pessimist or you're cynical or only see problems everywhere. And let's face it, some of the headwinds that we have that slow down or make it impossible to see the progress we seek are massive. And we talked briefly about foreign aid. What the world spends on foreign aid is minuscule compared to what we, on the other hand, spend on the negative consequences that we see in terms of our economic models and so on. So I'm an optimist by nature. I'm an optimist by profession. But more importantly, I think Cambodia got a lot right over these last 30 years or so. And it has a very committed, young, dedicated population. Okay, we can debate how young they still are, but by definition, still young. And as this generation has now come in to the society in terms of being in jobs, in government, in private sector, in civil society, I'm very optimistic that Cambodia is on a path where it can get it right. Can't take it for granted. And of course, to some extent, it's exposed to what's happening around itself. But I think if we focus on that 2050 goal and understand that it is peace, development, and human rights go hand in hand, and eventually we need to talk about all human rights, the easy ones and the tricky ones, you end up with a rule-based society where Cambodians can benefit from their rights, where they are being held accountable to their responsibilities to society, but where it's fair and open. Cambodia can be really shining because it has a richness that also will attract a lot of people to it if we continue to have the conditions right for people to continue coming, be that tourists, be that investors. So I hope this makes sense, but yes, I am an optimist.
It does make sense.
Call me naive, but I'm an optimist.
Well, it does make sense because I'm the same as you.
Yeah.
I'm an optimist because we have to, particularly in our work.
Yeah.
But also we have to we have to put more efforts to look at all of the positives.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier. It's a fallback.
It's the only way you make progress in the end as well. Right?
It's always a fallback kind of human nature to always see negative things. It's almost like the danger, right? You have to always be aware of.
Yeah.
And yet we ignore the positive developments over the years. So because of that, I try to be more optimistic, but also I try to be to look at the whole picture as much as we can, as an institution, as personally working, and this particularly with younger people. And as one way to stay energetic is to work with young people.
Sure.
And to stay energetic and to stay optimistic is to work with young people. So I'm going to leave it at that optimism, as that notes of optimism. Well, thank you, Joe, for spending the time and also be our guinea pig as our first guest. And I hope the conversation has been enjoyable for you and for the audience also.
Well, to me, very enjoyable. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the team for setting it up. No, very enjoyable. I hope it gets the feedback you hope to get with the series. The guinea pig, maybe the first one is a miss. We don't know, but I wish you many, many more. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
There's so many other things. There's other issues we can.
Well, I circle back in the future.
We can always dig deeper and discuss many of the big pictures and big topics that we just try to cover now. Well,
we'll do another one at some point.
Well, we'll have to. I hold you accountable to
no worries. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.